Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our third Company of Scholars lecture for this academic year. This is our chance to hear from our most distinguished and creative scholars in our Yale community and hear about the wonderful things they're doing, hopefully in a way that's accessible to a broad range of interest in the room. Today, I am very pleased to have Nick Christakis here, who will tell us about social networks, which from my naive point of view means we've come here together in this room to find out why we're together here in this room. And if I read some of his literature, his publications right, it may turn out that we're all genetically linked. I'm not sure, but I think we might be. So Nick is the Saul Goldman Family Professor of Social and Natural Science in the Department of Sociology, and he also has appointments in the Department of Medicine, Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and Biomedical Engineering. So this makes him a true citizen of our campus. I think he's covered just about every school we have. Maybe you need one in the law school. Anyway. His background for a professor of sociology is somewhat unusual. After graduating from Yale College, he earned both an MD and MPH degree from Harvard. And then he went to UPenn for his residency and decided that the next thing he needed was a PhD in sociology, which he earned at UPenn. His first faculty appointment was in the sociology department at the University of Chicago, where he stayed for many years and rose to the rank of professor. He then moved to Harvard in 2001 and was there until 2013 when he joined the faculty at Yale. He's received numerous awards for his innovative work, including election to the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Science. He currently studies health and social networks with a focus on how ill health, disability, health behavior, healthcare, and the end of life of a person influences the social network around that person. And he's also co-director of the Yale Institute for Network Science. Welcome.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you for having me. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you again for having me. So most of the work I'm going to be discussing today is joint work I've done with my close friend and collaborator, James Fowler, who's at UCSD. And I'd like to start with a set of claims about human sociality and how humans are connected to each other, briefly introduce some of the work we've done on the evolutionary biology of human social interactions to set the stage for how a deeper understanding of how humans are connected and why they're connected then permits us to design public health and other interventions in a way that makes the world better. So how can we use a deep understanding of human interactions to intervene in the world to improve diverse outcomes, whether it's outcomes related to health, innovation, cooperation, civic engagement, security, wealth production, and so forth. Because in fact, humans are embedded in social networks, and these networks obey very deep and fundamental mathematical, biological, psychological, and sociological rules and principles. And taking this into account gives us a chance to turbocharge behavioral interventions, such that if we can deliver them to particular individuals in shrewd and tactical ways, we can actually lead to population-level change in all kinds of ways. And in fact, what it can lead us to do is what I would like to think of as a radical shift in public health interventions. So we begin to think about not just how our interventions affect the people to whom we give our interventions, but how our interventions affect the people to whom we do not give our interventions. How people's embeddedness in networks allows us to take a broader perspective, a broader view on how it is that manipulating or intervening in the social world creates spillover and cascade effects. And in fact, we can use our understanding of social network structure for good, to advance good in diverse sorts of ways. Actually, this is a kind of a dual-use technology, so during the Q&A we can also talk about how you can use the same ideas for bad, but that's another topic. So I'm interested in real social networks, the kind we humans have been making and embedding ourselves in for tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of years, and not just the recent online variety, although I have something to say about that as well. So here is a typical network sociogram. Every dot is a person. Every line, and it's hard to see the lines unfortunately, but every line between the two dots represents a relationship between two people. And what's interesting is that each of us inherits our relatives, but picks our friends and our spouse, picks our coworkers, our neighbors to some extent, and each of those people to whom we are connected in turn is doing the same thing. And as a result of that, we assemble ourselves into this really ornate structure. This is, to my eye, the human analogy of ant colonies. So each person is making these choices on an individual level, but as a result, we give rise to a greater whole. And we proceed to live out our lives embedded in particular locations within this graph. And your fate in life, therefore, comes to depend not only on your own attributes, not only on your own decision making, your own biology, your own clinical circumstances, your own psychology, and so forth, but also on the structure of the graph and where you are in the network. So trivially, for instance, individuals that are located here are going to be much more likely to get communicable diseases than individuals that are located here, quite apart from their immune system, for instance, how their immune system is performing. Or individuals who lose their job and are here are going to be more likely to be able to find a new job than individuals over here, quite apart from their human capital, education, or other attributes. So where you are in the graph can affect your fate in all kinds of ways. And to my eye, these kinds of networks are intricate things of beauty. And they are so elaborate and so complex and so ubiquitous, in fact, and they have such a particular structure that can be defined mathematically, that it has to be the case that their structure and function is not a coincidence. That there must be, in my judgment or my opinion, some reason we form networks with this particular structure that we can see here. And in fact, whenever human social networks have been mapped, they always look strikingly similar. So in the upper left, we have about 56 high school students and who are their friends. In the upper right, 105 college students and who are their friends. In the lower right, there are 400 people drawn from a sample of 8 million people using NSA-type metadata on phone calls for a whole nation. You can map the social interactions among all of these individuals, zoom in, let's say, on a group of 400, and see who's calling who. And you can define who's calling who in diverse ways, like very intense, frequent calling, reciprocal calling, and so forth, to get a sense of the social relationships between people. And so that's 400 people there. And on the lower left is a scientific co-authorship network, scientists collaborating with each other. And all of these networks look visually the same, and in fact, mathematically can be quantified and shown to be plausibly extremely similar. And this consistency raises the possibility that we evolve to have networks and to have networks with a very particular structure. And our lab has been amassing evidence that it is indeed not a coincidence that we form networks with particular properties. And we've been able to show or find suggestive evidence for an evolutionary significance to and heritability of social network structure and function. And that phenomena like homophily, for instance, the fact that we prefer the company of people we resemble. I mean, ask yourselves this. It's widely known, since Plato at least, that people prefer the company of people they resemble. And to my eye, most explanations for this phenomena nowadays, or until recently, have been relatively tautological. So you ask, let's say, psychologists, why do people prefer the company of people they resemble? They say, well, people are more comfortable in the presence of people they resemble. Why are they more comfortable in the presence of people they resemble? Because they resemble them. It's a kind of a circular argument. It doesn't, in my judgment, get to the heart of the matter, which is, well, why? Why do we feel this affinity for individuals that we resemble? And other properties of social networks, like peer influence. You know, why as a species do we evince social learning? Why are we affected by others? And there are many, many thoughts that go back quite a long time in this regard. But my general point is that these thoroughgoing observations about our social life, that we prefer the company of people we resemble, that we're influenced by them, that people have a taste for friendship, for instance. Or ask yourself this, why do we have friends at all? I mean, other species don't form long-term, non-reproductive unions to other members of their species. It's actually exceedingly rare in the animal kingdom that we evince this property of having long-standing friendships with specific identifiable other individuals. So all these things we take for granted in large measure, I think have very fundamental explanations. And understanding those explanations then, which I'm only going to briefly review today, serves as a predicate for designing interventions that I think can be beneficial in diverse sorts of ways. And I guess the most summary statement I would make about the evolutionary role of networks is that it must be the case, I think, that across evolutionary time, the benefits of a connected life must outweigh the costs. So coming near other people exposes us to certain risks of infection, of violence, of misinformation, and so forth, but also coming near them gives us certain opportunities, and the calculus across time must be that it's beneficial to us to connect with others and in particular ways. Well, one of the things we did, one initial paper we did a few years ago, looked at the so-called heritability of network position. And so one of the things, and this sets the stage for a number of other ideas we'll be discussing today, is a very basic sort of primer on social network position. So here's a typical network of real people and their friendships. And the thing you need to appreciate about this is that there are different structural positions within the graph. So that, for example, individual B has 4 connections. These are friendships among these people. And individual D has 6 connections. And this is known as the degree of a node. And people vary in their degree. Some people have 4 friends. Some people have 6 friends. Some people have no friends. People know how many friends they have. But there are other attributes of people's position within the graph that they might not necessarily be able to appreciate. For instance, consider nodes C and D. C has 6 friends, and so does D. And if you talk to them, this might be the limit of their understanding of their social life. I have 6 friends, you have 6 friends. But we, with this bird's eye view, can see that there's a difference between the two. And I can cultivate this intuition in you by asking you, who would you rather be if a deadly germ was spreading through the network? C or D? D, right? You have the intuition that D is going to be less likely to get whatever's spreading and less likely to get it early in the course of the epidemic. Conversely, who would you rather be if a juicy piece of gossip were spreading through the network? C. And this can be quantified mathematically. It's the centrality of a node, and there are different kinds of ways this can be done using eigenvector centrality or betweenness centrality. And the same kind of mathematics is at the core of Google's PageRank algorithm that serves up pages. The magic of Google is that when it's given a set of pages that features a topic, pages at the top are the ones that are more like C and less like D. Finally, if you look at nodes A and B both have 4 connections. But the difference between the two is that the friend of a friend of A's is back again a friend of A's. The friend of a friend of A's is back again a friend of A's, whereas the friend of a friend of B's is not a friend of B's. So now imagine that you were a prehistoric human and you were going out to kill a mastodon and you wanted to get a bunch of people together to go kill the damn thing. Who would you rather be, do you think, A or B? A. Want to get your tight-knit group of friends together to cooperate, go out and kill the mastodon. But if the challenge was not to kill the mastodon, but rather to find the mastodon, you would rather be B, because the redundancy of information is much higher in A than B. Do you know where the mastodon is? No, do you know where the mastodon is? Your friend's friend is your friend, comes right back to you. Whereas in the case of B, you can reach further into the graph to bring back information, for instance, about the location of predators or prey. This is a very stylized, very quick set of toy illustrations of some of the ideas. But the basic point is that different positions within the network are different and can be quantified in various specific ways. And one study we did that was published now 5 years ago looked at the extent to which each of those 3 traits and others, which I'm not going into today, are seen as heritable. So on the y-axis is the percent of the variance that's explained, or the heritability of these traits, and on the x-axis is these 3 traits. And on the far left is the number of connections, or the degree of a node. And what this slide says is that 46% of the variation in how many friends people have can be explained by their genes. Now, this is not a shocking result. People vary in their taste for friendship. Some of us are shy, some people are gregarious. That people would have variation in this is not a big surprise. But we also found that these higher order properties of network structure also seem to vary. And 47% of the transitivity, which is that other difference between A and B node, is also heritable. And this is one of the more bizarre results to come out of our lab in the last few years, because what I've just told you is that if you have Tom, Dick, and Harry in a room, whether Dick is friends with Harry depends not just on Dick's genes or on Harry's genes, but on Tom's genes. Whether you two guys are friends with each other depends on her genes. How can that be? Well, we think the reason is that people vary in their tendency to introduce their friends to each other. Some people knit the network around them together, and some keep the network separate and apart and have a difference in this tendency. And finally, even 29% of the variation in how central you are in the network can also be explained by your genes. So we've done more work in this area, but the general kind of summary I would give is that this fundamental reality of our desire for connection, and consequently our susceptibility to certain kinds of social influence, it turns out has always been with us. And where you are in this vast fabric of humanity can depend in part on your genes. Now, if it's the case that network structure has genetic antecedents and evolutionary significance, it begs the question of how ancient this structure is and whether we could document such structural features in human populations living in non-modernized settings. So our fantasy here was, well, if you could go back 10,000 years and look at humans in the Pleistocene, could you find evidence that the networks they made were the same as our networks, guided, as it were, by this sort of fundamental biology that is within us? Now, obviously, we can't do that, but we hit upon the idea of instead mapping the social networks of a human population that lives like we did 10,000 years ago, specifically the Hadza hunter-gatherers of Tanzania. This is one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer populations on the planet. They hunt and they gather for their food. They sleep out under the stars. They have very limited material possessions to speak of. Every 6 weeks they move around. They're a natural fertility population. And there are 17 camps in Hadza land arranged around Lake Ayasi, about 300,000 square kilometers. So one of my postdocs who had some experience there, and Frank Marlowe, one of the leading ethnographers of the Hadza, collaborated with us to do this project. And what we did is, and there are only about 1,000 of them left. Only about 1,000 Hadza left. Only about half of those are adults. And what we did is we made a photographic census of all living adult Hadza, a kind of Hadza Facebook. And we took these posters into the field, and then we asked every adult Hadza we could find to identify their friends in different sorts of ways. And then we studied this network and other kinds of features of Hadza life in all kinds of ways. But the bottom line for today is that what we found is that mathematically and visually, Hadza social networks look just like ours. So despite the fact that in the intervening 10,000 years we've invented agriculture, we've invented cities, we've invented telephony, the social networks that we make look just like the social networks that the Hadza made in a very different kind of evolutionarily relevant environment. In addition, while we were there, we got the Hadza to play what is known as a public goods game. We tested how cooperative they were, how willing they were to collaborate with others by giving them honey sticks and asking them whether they wanted to donate honey sticks to their neighbors and if the neighbors would reciprocate in all kinds of ways I won't go into. But as a result, we were able to quantify how altruistic each respondent was. And that's shown by the dot size and color here. The red dots are the defectors, the really, the lousy guys that take advantage of their neighbors. The yellow dots are the kind, sort of altruists here, and the orange dots are in between. And what we find is that Hadza cooperativity clusters in the graph in certain very specific and actually we think highly relevant ways. Because it turns out that it is much easier for cooperation and other valuable phenomena to emerge and be sustained when people can control the structure of their networks, as we'll see in a little bit. And it turns out that there's a deep relationship between goodness and social networks. So we then also, while we were there looking at this question of what is the graph structure of the Hadza networks, we also evaluated certain ideas we had about the role that network structure might play in the collective expression of desirable properties, like information flow, immunity, collective immunity, and cooperation. Now, a lot of the work that we have done, which I'm not showing you today, uses observational methods where we study using statistical and econometric techniques different sorts of graphs. But we've also, over the last few years, begun to do some experiments, which is the main focus of today's talk. Because these experiments have allowed us to get around some of the difficult issues of causal inference using observational data, but they also give us exquisite control over some of the phenomena we want to study. And in particular, we become progressively more interested in the pro-social functions of networks. And so our experiments also allow us to not only address the methodologic issue of causal inference, but also to focus down on certain specific things we're interested in, which is how networks are used for good ends. This is one experiment that we published a few years ago. In this example, college students were brought into the laboratory. They were strangers to each other. They were given a little bit of money that they could play with, and they were invited to contribute the money, and they were randomly assigned into groups of 4. And they could contribute the money to the common good, and if they did that, the researcher would multiply the money, and then the money would be divided across all 4 individuals. So the individual pays a price, but there's a net benefit to the group. From the point of view of any given individual, what they should do is defect, like sort of be a free rider on hope everyone else cooperates and contributes to the common good, but they do nothing. They'll make the most money that way. But of course, if everyone does that, then the group, you have a tragedy of the commons, the group collapses. And of course, the group does best if everyone cooperates and contributes to the collective good. So that was the setup in this experiment. And then what would happen is a bell would ring, and people would be randomly assigned to new partners, and then a bell would ring, and they'd be randomly assigned to new partners, and so forth and so on for 6 rounds. And so what we were able, therefore, to do is to reconstruct social networks and explore a topic which hadn't previously been explored. So what was interesting to us here is not, if I am kind to Lynn, does Lynn reciprocate the kindness, a kind of direct reciprocity, nor, which has been widely studied and is actually also a difficult topic, nor were we interested so much in the topic of indirect reciprocity, which is if I am kind to Lynn, is Stephen then kind to me? Perhaps Stephen sees I'm a kind of guy, expects me to reciprocate to him. Perhaps he wants to reward me for my kindness to Lynn. That's indirect reciprocity. What we were interested in is if I'm kind to Lynn, is she then kind to Stephen? And is Stephen then kind to you? Is there a kind of a spreading process in the network such that we could show a kind of social contagion of altruistic behavior here experimentally. And that's exactly what we were able to show. What we were able to show is that if Eleni is kind to Lucas in period 1, Lucas is kind to Erica in period 2, Erica is kind to Jay in period 3, and Jay is kind to Brecken in period 4, a kind of geodesic spread of altruism in this network. And this is another very bizarre result to come out of our lab in the last few years, because what I've just told you is that how Jay treats Brecken depends on how Eleni treated Lucas, even though neither Jay nor Brecken ever interacted with Eleni or Lucas. Here shown in an experimental setting where we have exquisite control over the topology of the network and the interactions between the individuals. And this geodesic spread of kindness is different from the temporal persistence of kindness, such that if Eleni is kind to Lucas in period 1, Lucas learns to be kind and goes on to be kind to Erica in period 2, and Lysander in period 3, and Bemi in period 4, and so forth. In fact, if you fold back all the downstream kindness accruing, for every extra dollar Eleni gives Lucas, the network functions as a kind of matching grant, doubling the downstream benefits to the population, conditional on the structure of the graph. Here a structure we cause experimentally, but of course naturally we make different kinds of structures. So pay it forward is real in this situation. Yeah?
I'm not following this logic completely.
Yeah? I'm moving very fast. I apologize because this is sort of a preamble, believe it or not, to where I actually want to go today. But yes, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
How do you know they wouldn't have donated or been kind to each other without this initial?
So in this case,
control in other words.
okay. So in this case, what we're doing is we're controlling the sequence of interactions. So it's not as if I induce you to be very kind and him counterfactually to not be kind. So people behave naturally how they're wont to do, but we control the sequence of their interactions and examine if you chose to be kind in the first period, what happens thereafter, and if he chose not to be kind in the first period, what happens thereafter. Both kindness and unkindness spread, but for various reasons I don't want to go into right now, kindness outstrips the spread of unkindness. And the net result of which is that for every extra dollar the first guy chooses to give, the network, the ripple effects that we discern. So this is a study trying to quantify and observe the ripple effects. So I could imagine putting you in a room with someone and seeing how do you act, are you nice or not? Fine. But then I could also ask, well, gee, what happens if he's nice or unkind? How far does it spread in the graph? Are there ripples? And this was the purpose of this study, was to see those ripples and quantify them. Other studies I'll show you in a moment do other manipulations to try to achieve the following objective. Say you're unkind. Can I put you in a graph with a structure and other features, other design features that make you kind? Can I control your behavior by structurally manipulating the nature of your interactions? And I'll show you some experiments to that effect in a moment. Other questions? So using observational and experimental methods, we and others have provided evidence that a variety of behaviors and phenomena spread within networks via social contagion. So obesity, smoking, drinking, and drug use behavior, emotional states like happiness, loneliness, depression. I just showed you one little experiment with altruism. Crime, Andrew Papachristos here at Harvard is doing some beautiful work on crime and its spread. Voting behavior, I'll show you that in just a moment. Purchasing behavior and ideas. So different kinds of behaviors spread in graphs via processes of social contagion. And in fact, people's attitudes, decisions, and behaviors depend in quantifiable ways on the attitudes, decisions, and behaviors of others around them. And in fact, a key idea about networks is that they magnify whatever they are seeded with. Networks magnify whatever they are seeded with, but they must be seeded. They don't on their own sui generis give rise to phenomena. Some external force must impinge, which gets the process started like an epidemic, and then the network takes over and makes more of whatever it is the thing that you introduced into the graph. And in fact, to our eye, one of the sort of deep purposes of networks is to function as a kind of social magnifying glass. And we've begun to think about how to exploit this magnification property and other fundamental observations about network structure in order to maximize our ability to induce behavior change with interventions in populations by exploiting this understanding of how networks form and operate. Now, to be clear, we're affected in another way by networks as well. It's not just what's happening around us, whether the people around us are behaving altruistically or gaining weight, for instance, that matters. The actual structure of the network also matters. So think about these two objects that we all studied in high school chemistry. As we all know, they're both made of carbon. But the difference between the two is that on the left you have graphite, which is soft and dark, and on the right you have diamond, which is hard and clear. And this originates in the difference to how the carbon atoms are connected to each other. You take the carbon atoms and you connect them one way, you get graphite, which is soft and dark. Connect them another way, you get diamond, which is hard and clear. And there are two key ideas here about these allotropes of carbon. First, these properties of softness and darkness and hardness and clearness are not properties of the carbon atoms, they're properties of the collection of carbon atoms. And second, which properties you get depends on how you connect the carbon atoms to each other. Connect them one way, you get one set of properties. Connect them another way, you get a different set of properties. And similarly, the pattern of our connections in social networks can give the group properties that are not present within the individuals, properties which can vary conditional on how you connect the same human beings to each other. Connect them one way, one set of properties. Connect them another way, different set of properties. It's the ties between people that make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. And new properties can emerge because of the connections, because of the ties between people, and not necessarily because of the people themselves. So it's not just what's happening in the people around us that matters, it's the structure of the graph that can also matter. Now, these sorts of observations suggest two broad ways to intervene in networks for good, to enhance public health and public policy in a variety of ways. And the two broad ways are to manipulate connection, to change the structure of the graph, who knows who, to experiment or manipulate the topology, or to manipulate contagion. Given a certain structure, given a pattern of interactions between people, who do you target, let's say, with information? Or if you're a terrorist, who do you infect so that you get the maximum bang? Like, which one person should you infect to really infect the whole population? This would be a kind of contagion intervention given a particular structure. And there's expanding science in both areas. So I'm going to show you some experiments with some applications to positive outcomes that we and others have been doing now. This is one of my favorite illustrations of this idea. It takes a minute to set this up, but I think the payoff is really worth it. This was work done by a former postdoc of mine while he was in our lab using an experimental platform that we've developed that allows us to recruit people from around the world and come in and participate in experiments of varying duration in a virtual laboratory, real people in a virtual online lab. And in this situation, what we did is we created two different worlds in which people would be dropped into. A world on the left and the world on the right. In both of these worlds, there were precisely 128 people. And there were multiple replicates of this, but I'm just speaking as if there were two worlds. There were many variants there were multiple replicates of each of these two worlds. In each of these two worlds are 128 people. And in each of these worlds, every single person is connected to precisely 6 other people. So for example, here, this yellow dot is connected to these 6 red people, and here this yellow dot is connected to these 6 red dots over here. And if you talk to people in these worlds, I would say to you, how many people in your world? 128. How many in yours? 128. How many friends do you have? 6. How many friends do you have? 6. How many friends do your friends have? They all have 6 friends. Ditto for you. And yet the structure of the network is completely different. And we, with this bird's eye view, can now see that the structure is different. And the question is, does this structure affect what happens to the group, net of the individuals? Now, it used to be thought, so if I asked you, let's say you can infect this individual here with a germ, or this individual, do you have intuitions into in which of these worlds the pathogen will spread more rapidly and more completely? The left network or the right network? The left network, yeah. Because in the first time step, the yellow dot infects the 6 red dots, and the next time step, it infects all the other dots that he knows. Whoosh, the network flushes, you get the whole population is evincing the epidemic. Whereas on the right, the epidemic has to spread in a very plodding way, slowly across the graph before it reaches the other side. And the same kind of thing, of course, happens with information spread. So the dynamics of information flow would be better in the left than on the right. And it used to be thought that everything spread better in random networks than in neighborhood networks. But it turns out that only things that spread by so-called simple contagion spread better in random networks than in neighborhood networks. Things that spread by so-called complex contagion spread better in networks with a structure on the right. For example, consider the idea of smoking cessation. Imagine these are smokers on an online site where we're trying to get people to quit smoking, and you persuade the yellow dot to quit smoking. Here on the left-hand side, this guy might have some weak effect on these 6 individuals, but each of those individuals is now surrounded by other smokers. So his ability to manifest the behavior to which he's just been exposed is attenuated by the presence nearby of other people who are still smokers. Whereas here, this individual affects these 6 people, and it creates a frontier where each of these people on the frontier is connected to 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 other people who've just quit smoking. So smoking cessation spreads like a wave in the network on the right, but extinguishes in the left. Same with cooperation. If you persuade this guy to be cooperative, he might have some weak effect on these guys, but they're all surrounded by defectors who take advantage of them. Whereas here, you can get a kind of cooperative wave that spreads through the graph. And furthermore, to cultivate an intuition in you about the difference between these two, I could show you that you can convert this graph to this graph by manipulating a single parameter. For example, imagine you cut these two ties and those two ties and rewired the two ties across, creating a shortcut across the middle. That actually preserves the degree distribution. Everyone's still connected to 6 people and so forth. But you should have the intuition that now if the germ reaches here, it can skip right across to the other side. And in fact, by repeatedly, iteratively cutting and pairs of ties and rewiring the network at random, eventually you convert this graph to that graph. So the two can be manipulated in this fashion. But the point is that different things spread differently in the two networks. So you now could live in one of these two worlds, and the same individual in these two worlds could have very different fates. In one world, the world is organized in a way that makes you quit smoking and be cooperative and be less susceptible to infections or to the spread of information. And in the other world, it's precisely the opposite. So this group level property, it's like the carbon atoms. It's like softness and darkness and hardness and clearness. The social graph gives the groups properties that transcend the individual elements within the graph. Here shown experimentally by manipulating the connections and watching and seeing what happens in ways I won't go elaborate that was done in this paper. So this would be a connection intervention. I could take, for example, a group of engineers that work in a firm and say, how can I make these engineers more or less inventive? Or I can take a group of students and try to get them to quit smoking or be nicer to each other. How can I manipulate their graph? How can I arrange the ties between them in a fashion that makes them behave better in different sorts of ways through a manipulation that controls the topology of the network? Another experiment that we've done that we just published a couple of years ago looks at another kind of regime where we manipulate connection. In this experiment, we did the following thing. We took individuals and we dropped them into an Urgis-Renyi random graph, which was initiated by us. So we specify using this sort of mathematical process a graph, a topology, a structure of the network. And then we take people and we drop them into specific locations within the graph. And we have them play a public goods game with their neighbors, just the people around them, like the public goods game I described earlier. And here in this graph, in this regime, the red dots are the defectors and the blue dots are the cooperators. And here people are dropped into a graph where they're stuck with the neighbors that we picked. And they can, in the first round, they cooperate or defect. And what we find across time in a world in which people have no control over their social ties is that cooperation disappears from the system. You're initially a cooperator, you're stuck with all these defectors, you say to hell with that, and you switch to defection yourself. So by the end, everyone becomes a defector. Cooperation is not sustained in a network which has this topological regime on the bottom. And this was a result previously theorized by many others and experimentally shown by many others in the past. So we replicate that result. But then in the top, we add a wrinkle. In the top, we give people an additional option. So not only can they choose whether to cooperate or defect, but at every time step, we give them the opportunity to cut ties to people who are defectors and to form ties to people who are cooperators. Actually, they could also form ties to defectors if they wanted. We don't specify. But we give them a little control over their social structure. And in this type of a world, we find that cooperation persists. In a world in which we give people not only the ability to reciprocate, not only to evince behavioral reciprocity, but also to evince tie reciprocity, where they can manipulate the structure of their network, we can create a world in which people behave better. So I can take you guys and by specifying one set of rules of interaction, make you mean sons of bitches to each other, or I can take you guys and specify a different rule of interaction. I can make the same people kind and nice to each other by controlling not who you are, but how you interact with each other, here shown experimentally. In subsequent experiments that I'm not going to present today, we explored the parameter space. We explored how much rewiring is optimal to create optimal cooperation in social groups based on some theory that other people have done that suggests that actually it should be parabolic, that there's too much rewiring and too little rewiring, and that it's the middle range of rewiring, the middle range of social mutability that optimizes cooperation in human groups. Yeah, so this shows, in this particular experiment, we had there were, I don't know, a couple thousand subjects in this experiment. We had 4 different treatments. This is the fraction of cooperative players at the beginning. Here's the round of gameplay. This is sort of time over an hour or so on the x-axis. Here is the fixed network in green. Everyone starts at around 60% cooperation, and over time, the green line shows a decline in cooperation. And here I showed you the so-called fluid dynamic situation in which people are allowed some dynamism in their network, and cooperation persists across time. And we explored how much dynamism was needed, also allowing a viscous dynamic situation, and then cooperation disappears if there's not enough fluidity in the social ties. So those are a couple of experiments illustrating how you can manipulate the wiring, the topology of a network, and get groups to behave differently in desirable ways. Let me show you a couple of experiments. Any questions so far? Yeah.
What was the nature of the viscous dynamic? Was it like after only certain rounds, or they could only choose one other person?
Yeah, so we had a number of ways of doing that. The gist of it was the mechanics were at any given round, the computer did an inventory of all existing ties, picked in the fluid dynamic a simple random sample of 30% of the ties, whether they were of all possible ties. So there were 20 people, so there are 20 times 19 divided by 2 possible ties, some of which exist, some of which do not. So there are couplets on either side of those ties. And then with 30% probability, couplets that were joined, one person was chosen at random and asked, do you want to cut the tie? And couplets that didn't exist, one person was chosen at random and said, do you want to form a tie? And so that at every round, that was what happened. And then in subsequent experiments, we manipulated whether it was 10% or 20 or 30 or 100% of the ties were up for grabs at any given time. Other questions? So this is another set of experiments in which now we are this is our sort of a more public healthy kind of work we're doing. So imagine now, for example, that you have, this is a paradigmatic example, that you have sets of villages in the developing world. And you go and you map the networks of these villages. So you have the village on the left and the village on the right. And then you choose 6 people at random in this right-hand village, the yellow dots, and you target them for a public health intervention, a clean water intervention or a polio vaccination intervention. And the conventional public health point of view on this topic is that you give these people the intervention, and you come back a year later and you see what fraction of the 6 people adopted the intervention. Maybe 3 of the 6 adopted the intervention. But our interest is not so much in whether the people to whom you gave the intervention responded, but rather what did all the other people in the village do when you gave these 6 people the intervention. So maybe 6 of these 3 people were given the intervention, 3 adopted, but they recruited 3 of their friends. A total of 6 people in this village evinced the desirable public health intervention, whereas in the control village that didn't get the intervention, perhaps by secular change, 2 people adopted this new clean water practice or whatever it is. So the difference between 6 and 2 gives you an estimate of the pure peer effects under control in this situation. But with this sort of paradigm, now we can begin to imagine kind of more inventive ways of choosing these 6 people. Maybe instead of picking them at random, we might pick 6 central people, 6 people that have these particular attributes of being in a structurally influential, we might imagine, location within the graph. Now perhaps of these 6 people, again, 3 of them might adopt, but they might recruit 30 of their friends. And on the left, again, 2 in the control village. Same villages, same number of people, same intervention, 10 times the impact, because now we've picked individuals who are structurally influential. It's not, what's important to us in this case is not attributes of the individuals, if they're tall or short or rich or poor, but where they are in the graph that we need to define and then pick them and target them using algorithms that people like Dan Spielman and others at YINS are inventing. So we take some of that technology and we say, okay, what does the mathematics of networks tell us about who should have the biggest impact if we were going to rationally target individuals in the network? And there's another way that this could be done, because one of our interests is we don't want to just invent research tools for understanding how to change population behavior. We want to invent tools that people could actually use in the real life developing world settings. And so mapping networks is expensive and time consuming. So we would ideally like a way of identifying structurally influential individuals without having to map the network, especially if mapping is not feasible. In particular, also because mapping is not scalable. So the question is, can we identify structurally influential people without having to map the network of the whole population? And it turns out that there is a mathematical fact about social networks that's known as the friendship paradox that can be summarized by the observation that your friends have more friends than you do. Did you know this? Your friends have more friends than you do. Actually, your sexual partners have more sexual partners than you do too, and your co-authors have more co-authors than you do, and this is just a general property of social networks. The average person in a graph has mu friends, but the average friend of the average person has mu plus the variance divided by mu friends. So if there's heterogeneity in degree, if people vary in the number of friends they have, the average person has the average number of friends, but the average friend of an average person has a higher number. And in the limiting condition, you can imagine that, that if everyone had the same number of friends, then your friends would have as many friends as you do. And if there's a lot of extreme skewness to the distribution, there might be one person who has many friends. And that also illustrates the point. For instance, imagine that there is a party host that has a party and has 100 friends and invites all of them to the party, and each of those people have no friends. You've got 101 people in the room. And now you sample from those people and you ask them, who is your friend? 100 people would name their party host, and that party host has 100 friends. So for 100 of the people in this extremely skewed distribution, their friends would have more friends than they did. Only when you pick the party host would their friend have fewer friends than they do. So on average, your friends would have more friends than you do. I can furthermore cultivate this intuition by asking you to consider the edge conditions. So for instance, look at the people on the periphery of the network. This person has only one friend. That's why they're on the edge. But by construction, that friend must have more friends than they do, must have two friends. So everyone on the edge has more, their friends have more friends than they do. And in fact, that same intuition holds all the way through the graph. That on average, if you pick the yellow dots at random and ask them to nominate their friends will have more friends than they do. And the reason this is extraordinarily useful and valuable is that you can take this idea and then identify structurally influential people without mapping the graph. You pick people at random in the population, ask them to nominate their friends, and you give the treatment to the friend of the random people, not to the people that you've picked themselves. So we use this idea as well in the experiment I'm about to show you. Because we've been doing field experiments of network targeting in diverse locations around the world. In Honduras, a site where we send about a half dozen Yaleys or more, about 8 Yaleys this past summer in our site in Limpira in Honduras with a vitamin and water purification intervention. In Uganda with HIV treatment. In India, we just finished a project on polio treatment. Online, I showed you some experiments, and we've also been doing some work on diffusion of innovation in physician networks. This is the region where we work in Honduras. It's a very poor, about $2 a day population. In highland Honduras, it's a coffee-growing region. There are these little compact villages that have an average of 200 or 300 people that live in them, and they're separated one village from another. It looks like this. And what we did is we mapped the networks for 32 villages in this area. Right now, we're also beginning to do a project where we're mapping 160 villages in a different area of Honduras. And we mapped these villages, and then what we did is we did a randomized trial in which we took 1/3 of the villages, and we picked 5% of the people in each of those villages and gave them a couple of public health interventions, a clean water chlorine intervention and a multivitamin intervention. In another 1/3 of the villages, we picked 5% of the people who had the highest in degree, who had the most friends. And in a third of the villages, we picked 5% of the people using the friendship paradox idea. So we picked people at random, and then we, for each person we picked at random, we went one step at random in the graph and picked that individual instead. And then to all those 5% in each village, we delivered a public health intervention. And our question was, can we move a whole village and not just individuals to change their behavior? Given a budget constraint, who do we target? Who creates the most externalities for behavior change? So if we put all our money in getting these 5% of people to do something better, can we change attitudes towards latrine adoption in India, or polio vaccination in Pakistan, or HIV treatment in Uganda? Like, how do we get people to change their minds about something by picking individuals not on their own attributes, but where they are in the graph? So this illustrates 2 of the targeting algorithms in one village. So for example, the in-degree targets look like they're in degree. They're more to the center, the yellow targets, and the random targets here are shown in orange. And here's one of my graduate students, Allison Huang, in the red cap, delivering the intervention. This was 2 or 3 years ago now. This is the Clorox intervention. And here are the results of the study. Here on the y-axis is the proportion adopting the clean water intervention, and the colored lines indicate, and on the x-axis, and I'm sorry, on the x-axis is time since targeting, and what we find is that there's no difference by targeting algorithm for the chlorine intervention. But by the multivitamin intervention, we find that in-degree targeting, the nomination targeting technique, works the most. So you can start with a 5% targeting, and you get nearly 75% adoption of vitamin practice over the course of a couple of weeks using the nomination targeting technique. We have many similar results, which I won't go into, and we have some ideas as to why there's a difference between these two types of interventions. This type of experimental work is still at early days in public health, and my hope and expectation is that over the coming decade, as more and more people try to use network methods to see how to change behavior at scale, we'll be able to get more generalizable knowledge about why some things work this way and some don't. So right now, we think that part of the reason for this has to do with a complex and simple contagion idea, that vitamin interventions might spread by simple contagion, but changing the way you clean your water might require reinforcement from those around you, so that there's not a lot of difference, not a lot of bang for the buck to be gained by different targeting algorithms in this type of a situation. Here's another experiment that was done by James Fowler. Many of you probably, unbeknownst to you, may have participated in this experiment. This was a randomized controlled trial, the largest ever done. 61 million people in the election 4 years ago were randomly assigned. If they were a Facebook user on election day 4 or 6 years ago, you were shown a little banner on the top of your Facebook page that said, "Today is election day. Find your polling place in the US. You can click here and find your polling place, and you can click a button that says whether you voted or not so far on that day." And the experimental manipulation involved showing people whether or not their friends had also clicked on that button. So the experimental manipulation was revealing to you, did your friends vote or not? To try to see, could we induce cascades of civic mindedness, of civic engagement, by manipulating the exposure to information about whether someone's people voted or not. And an important feature in this experiment is, because whether you vote or not is a public record, who you vote for is obviously not public, but whether you vote is, many millions of these people were also linked to their actual real life data, so we could link Facebook, click the I voted button, to did you actually vote, to actually get ground truth in this situation. And there's a lot of results in this paper, but the bottom line was that this is the increase in the number of validated votes because of the direct effect of exposing the individual. So let's say an extra 50,000 people voted as a result of this experiment, and they in turn influenced their friends. Now we could trace out the social contagion in the experiment. Now, experimentally, by seeding individuals with the intervention, an extra 300,000 people who were close friends of those individuals also voted. There's actually a lot more in this experiment, but one of the things that pleases me the most about this experiment is this was a scientific experiment conducted on a single day with a very weak stimulus, just showing people a little banner on their Facebook page whether or not they voted. And that simple little experiment, which was not done to improve our civic democracy, got 350,000 extra people to turn out to the polls on that day. There's a scientist doing a project that gets more Americans, hundreds of thousands more Americans, to go out and vote with a really trivial intervention of just showing them, did your friends vote or not? And many of you probably have the experience of traveling in a hotel and are probably familiar with the famous results that show that the way you're more likely to recycle your towels is not by an intervention, that a little card in the bathroom that says, recycle your towel, keep using your towels, save the planet, but actually a little intervention that says 75% of previous inhabitants of this room also kept their towels for their whole stay. And actually that's very powerful. People, keep their towels for this day. Don't throw them on the ground. Now, so we can exploit these ideas to enhance the response of behavioral interventions, as I've been saying, both amongst the untreated and among the treated. We can use it to deliberately create spillovers and to sort of reinforce the spread amongst the untreated, but we can also use these ideas to reinforce the behavior among the treated by trying to get people who are doing something good to be surrounded by other people who are doing the same good thing, to provide for them to keep doing it. And depending on how you do this, we estimate that often you can quadruple the return on investment from public health interventions by taking advantage of this type of a network effect. So people are connected, and so their health and their behaviors are connected. Now, how much time do I have left? I don't know till when we go.
So it's 8 minutes till 5, and we'd love to have time for questions.
Sure, and when are we supposed to end?
Around about 5.
Oh, around 5. Okay, because I had been told 5:30, and that's obviously wrong. So, okay, so I'm going to skip another experimental result that we had, And I'm just going to close then with one. So I had one other experiment I was going to show you, which involved not delivering information into the network, but extracting information from the network using some of the ideas we've been discussing. But that'll be another time. So I want to close with one big idea having to do with what it means when we intervene in a social network. Because I think such interventions provide us with a way to manipulate social capital. And in order to understand this, we have to consider the following idea. What's the point of a connected life? How does it help us as individuals and as a species? And it turns out that networks are a resource that we can all use. Networks are a kind of social capital. Now, most people, when they think about capital, think about money. But really, capital is any stock of resources that can be put to productive use, that you can do something with. And two further key ideas about capital are that in order to create capital, you have to invest skill and effort. You have to know something and do something to produce capital. And second, and much more interesting, and much more subtle, as far as I'm concerned, is that in order to create capital, really what you have to do is you have to make changes in a substance that make it yield a higher rate of return than it otherwise would. That on the deepest level, what capital creation is about is the transmutation of the natural world that makes the transmuted thing more productive than it was before. For example, a farm is a stock of capital. You can take a forest, you can invest skill and effort, you can transmute the natural world and you get a farm, and the farm is more valuable than the forest because you can do things with a farm you couldn't do with a forest, namely grow fruits and vegetables and grains and flowers, for instance. And that's what makes it a reservoir of wealth and a source of productive power, is this transmutation when you transmute the forest into the farm. So improved land is a form of capital. Or you can imagine taking this tree and you invest skill and effort and you transmute it into lumber. And the lumber is more valuable than the tree because you can do things with the lumber you couldn't do with the tree, such as invest still more skill and effort and convert it to a violin. And the violin is more valuable than the lumber because you can do things with the violin you couldn't do with the lumber. And at every step of the way, you invest skill and effort, you transmute the natural world, and you make something that is a stock of productive power. So capital is a change that allows a substance to act in new ways. And this is part of what makes it a store of wealth and a source of productive power. Now, a key innovation took place among social scientists in the 1960s to begin to think about human beings in this fashion. So you can take this dissolute former graduate student of mine on the left, who's a drunkard, and you can invest skill and effort and send him to Alcoholics Anonymous and clean him up, and now he becomes more productive and able to do things he wasn't previously able to do. Or you can invest still more skill and effort and give him a Yale or actually here a Columbia education, and you can make him still more productive. You can change his mind. You can work upon the neurons of his brain, and now he becomes a reservoir of wealth. You've transmuted the natural world, and you've imbued the transmuted object with properties that didn't exist before. And this is what we mean by capital production. Well, just like physical capital is created by a change in the material world, and human capital by a change in persons, social capital in organizations, in companies, in communities, in fact, in our whole society, is a change in the relations among persons, a change that renders the group more productive and capable of doing things it was not previously able to do. Thank you very much. Yeah, you want me to repeat questions? Okay. You don't call on people or you want me to?
No, you please go ahead.
Okay, Stephen.
Nick, I'd like to set this up with the observation that humans seem to have a very hard time understanding the population level consequences of individual decisions in terms of vaccines, antibiotic resistance, global warming, extinctions are all examples of population level consequences of individual decisions, but that seems to be paradoxical. If we have been living in stable networks since we were hunter-gatherers, why aren't our minds better at intuiting the things that you have to go out and create a big complex research program to discover?
Okay, so the question was, if in fact it's the case that, that humans have these effects on others, these externalities that we've been discussing, and if it's the case that humans evolved a certain cognitive equipment, why doesn't our cognitive equipment make us better able to avoid the tragedy of the commons? I think I think that's a very deep question, and I only have a partial answer to give today. And the partial answer would be that the evolutionarily relevant environment in which we evolved was actually very constrained. It was a face-to-face community, and the number of people that we actually interacted with was on a much smaller scale. And that, Dunbar, for example, suggesting that it's about 150 people. You look at the average size of overnight camps in the anthropological literature, it's about 30 people. These people all knew each other. I believe those people actually could see the externalities and could see that their friends of friends were affected and didn't have the reason to be aware of the impact of their behavior on people who were further away in the geodesic distance. So I think we have just enough cognitive capacity to take into account the externalities that affect the people that are actually quite near us, our friends and maybe our friends of friends, and not enough cognitive capacity to understand these other more complex kinds of things. So I think that's part of the reason why we are so bad at this. And I think there's been a broadening. I mean, if you look at the history of the world in the last 100 years, there's been a progressive broadening in the who counts as us versus them, right? So initially it's just, my little neighborhood, my family, my neighborhood, my nation. There's a globalization movement now in the 21st century. I'm supposed to care about unknown people on another continent, which was an alien idea to people even 300 years ago. Animals, we're supposed to care about animals in a way, like we're extending moral rights to animals. There's a progressive expansion of who are the we that we care about. Now that is a kind of philosophical cultural change that's still operating with a kind of biological equipment that's is still back in the Pleistocene, but still must respect that equipment in some way. So I think that's part of the answer to your very deep question. It's an incomplete answer. I apologize. Yeah, over here.
I have a question about the Facebook study.
Yes.
Your talk is entitled "Networks for Good," and an argument can be made that the researchers were doing this intervention for entirely benign reasons, even though the users were not asked for permission. My question is, given the fact that the NSA and people like that have real access to these networks, how do we know they're doing good things?
Yeah, so the question has to do with the thing I mentioned at the beginning, the dual use implications of this. So I didn't show you today some of the work we've been doing. After the Fukushima disaster, there was a lot of misinformation that was spreading in Japan on the internet about the extent of the radiation damage and everything else. And the Japanese government became very concerned with how do we facilitate the spread of true information that's beneficial to people as compared to false information that's causing alarm. And we've done some experiments, and I have a postdoc, a graduate student in my lab right now who's working on similar topics of how to manipulate information flow in networks to kind of open up the gates to let good information spread and tamp down the spread of bad information. And we've begun to get calls by people in authoritarian countries that are very interested in what we're doing, but not for the reasons that I care about. They obviously would be interested in, let's say, decreasing voting and reducing the spread. But this problem is not specific to the work we do or even to the social sciences. There's a long history, famously here at Yale with Arthur Galton, some of you know this case. It's a very moving case of a plant biologist working on the exploration of plant hormones, who later on discovers that his work had been used as a key ingredient in Agent Orange. And of course, nuclear energy is another classic example. So there are dual uses for this. The same ideas that I presented today to get developing world villages to adopt clean water can be used by Amazon to sell you, more widgets. So we're very mindful of this. There's also the case of the weaponization of influenza that was in the news a year or so ago. But I don't have a complete answer for you. I mean, I wouldn't say that we should shut down all research because some people could use it for evil purposes, but we're aware that it can be exploited. By the way, that experiment, the Facebook experiment, was entirely ethical. It was approved by the IRB. It has no more than minimal risk. There's studies like that are done all the time, including studies that involve administration of chemotherapeutic agents, actually. Yeah, over there.
So I was struck by the difference in the kinds of contagion where you had the intervention, the multivitamin intervention versus the Clorox intervention. And you sort of attributed it to different kinds of contagion.
Yes, I didn't attribute it. I speculated. I don't know.
My question was, well, first as a sort of anecdote, to what degree could you have predicted that fact, the two distinct outcomes of the two interventions? And sort of more generally, what do we do we understand what the distinction is between those two types of contagion so that we can assess whether a certain kind of process is going to percolate through one or through the other?
So the question had to do, is there any way that we can assess ex ante what kind of processes are more likely to percolate? And that's also a very deep question and is on the frontier in my judgment right now. And I'm going to beg your permission and I'm going to digress for 2 minutes to tell you a little fable that I think will illustrate this point. It's a bit off color, but I think I can do it without offending anyone. So now I have your attention. So imagine that you have 2 islands in the Pacific, and there are 100 people over here and 100 people over there. And on this island, everyone is having sex with everyone else. It's a fully saturated graph. There are 100 people, 100 times 99 divided by 2 sexual encounters. It's an orgy, okay? And over here, there are 100 people, and nobody's having sex with anybody else. They're all monks, okay? It's a monastic environment. Now, in neither of those 2 environments do you have an epidemic of venereal diseases. They're fine, these 2 worlds. Now, a little sailor washes up on shore, and he has sex with one person on this island or one person on that island. Where do you get the bigger epidemic? The one where everyone's having sex with everyone else. So the structure of the graph is highly relevant to the magnitude of the epidemic, but there's no epidemic unless the network is seeded. The network must be seeded. Once it's seeded, the network magnifies what it's seeded with. With me so far? Okay. Now imagine that you have 2 different islands. Everyone is having sex with everyone else. Everyone is having sex with everyone else now in these 2 islands, in both of them. But here everyone is immunocompetent. Their immune systems work. Here everyone is immunocompromised. Their immune systems do not work. Sailor washes up on the shore. Where do you get the bigger epidemic? Immunocompromised one. So it's not just enough to know about the attributes of the graph. You have to know about the attributes of the individuals. You need egocentric covariates that describe the people also are relevant into whether you get a spreading process in the graph. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a little piece of biology. This may be very useful to you in your future life, I don't know. If you have sex with someone who has active syphilis, you've got about a 1 in 3 chance of contracting syphilis. Whereas if you have sex with someone who has active HIV, you've got about I'm a physician, so I can say these things, about 1 out of 500 chance of getting HIV, depending on the sexual act and a number of other issues relating to viral load and stuff. So now you have 100 people, everyone's sex with everyone else, everyone's immunocompetent. 100 people, everyone's sex with everyone else, immunocompetent. Sailor washes up on shore. Here he has syphilis, here he has HIV. Where do you get the bigger epidemic? Syphilis. So it's not just the graph, it's not just the people, it's the thing itself that also determines the spreading dynamics. Now in the case of microbiology, we've got 100 years of knowledge that can shed light ex ante about the spreadability of these pathogens. How immunogenic are they? How big are they? What do we know about whether they express hydrophilic or hydrophobic proteins on their surfaces and so forth? But in the case of things like ideas or movies or public health interventions, we don't have that knowledge yet. We don't actually know how spreadable things are. And if you think, for instance, about movies, in other work we've done, we've looked at the cascade of movie appeal in networks. It's one thing to talk about how good a movie is. You can form an opinion of whether it's a good or bad movie. But a distinct attribute of the movie is whether you inform your friends about it. And you might do that whether this is a terrible movie, or you might see a terrible movie and not tell anyone about it. Or this is a good movie, and you might tell them or not. So the spreadability of the pathogen is different than the lethality of the pathogen. And the spreadability of a movie is different than the quality of the movie. And so ex ante, I can't tell you what these things do. We can theorize, and there are some domains in which there is such theory. So we are ex post speculating about some of these things. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Sort of? Yeah. Other questions? Yes, in the back. You, yeah.
Kind of abstract question. The last few slides about value, you talked about taking a forest and making a farm. You have more value, but you have more readily measurable value. But we're sort of, in the case of forests, learning now that actually they have a lot of value that's hard to measure. And I don't completely understand the translation between that capital and social capital, but I wonder if there are easier forms of social capital to measure, and through intervention you might lose less readily measurable forms of social capital.
So I think if I've understood your question correctly, the concern is about, just to pick the farm example, so I very blithely stated that the farm was more valuable than the forest, but of course it depends on what you're trying to do. If you want wood, clearing the forest was a really stupid thing. So it depends on your objective function. It depends on what is your objective, like what are you actually trying to achieve. So the value of the thing depends in part on what you're trying to achieve. And the same thing happens with social networks. If I'm trying to arrange you guys in a fashion that makes you optimal for the spread of information, like I'm saying, okay, I need to arrange these people in a way so that if I give a piece of information to one person, it's going to quickly spread through everyone. That's great, But then, oops, that's terrible if pathogens are spreading. That same structure is actually really bad if now I'm trying to prevent the spread of pathogens. So actually to specify what type of social arrangement is optimal requires you to specify what it is that you're trying to achieve. It's our contention that across evolutionary time, there's been a kind of integration across all of these things. That, that there's kind of a just right kind of an arrangement of social arrangement that is really good for the spread of information, but not so good that it facilitates the spread of pathogens. That's really good for supporting cooperation, but not so good that it reduces or increases redundancy of information in the graph. So that there's a kind of balance, we think, that has been achieved. And so in the social capital example, if I've understood your question, the argument would be that certain types of arrangements are very good for maximizing certain kinds of social capital, but might actually be horrible from another point of view. And the example that comes to mind is Nazism in the Second World War, right? The same social networks that can serve the purpose of getting us to reinforce desirable properties can whip people into a frenzy, right? And get people to act in really horrible and violent ways. And that would be a kind of capital, but put to bad ends. Yes, in the front here.
Yeah. One of the issues I forget which experiment it was indirect reciprocity. And so when we look at indirect reciprocity, it's easy to explain in hunter-gatherer groups where it's coming from kin relationships. When we move out of there, for example, Aranorn Zionists try to explain that what made it possible for us to have reciprocity with strangers is belief in moral gods who were sort of maybe part of our social network or looking over our shoulder and so forth. But it looks like we do care about reciprocity from people who are strangers.
Yes.
Not just our social network.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts of explaining that?
We do. We've done some work on that. First of all, on the God example, I'm not an expert in this area. I'm certainly not an expert in God, but there's an enormous literature, of, perhaps you know it, certainly on the philosophy of religion, but also on the history of religion, on the anthropology of religion, on the biology of religion. One set of ideas which I think has a lot of merit is a set of ideas that imagines that the emergence of a religious sensibility in human beings was grafted onto our sociality. So imagine that you and I share a belief in a deity. Let's imagine the deity is that light over there. But I don't know you. If you and I both believe in the same God, we've now become friends of a friend, right? So you're now suddenly 2 degrees removed from me via this other entity, this other node on the network. So if you imagine putting God in the network, all of a sudden everyone is connected to the same God, so now you can feel a kinship to other people who believe in the same deity as you do, but that belief system, that kinship, the utility of the religion is grafted onto what used to be a kind of social function, which is that you and I would be friends with each other. So this friendliness that we might feel among strangers has been, as a result of religion, has been actually grafted onto a friendliness we might have felt not among strangers originally. So there are a bunch of people advancing these ideas. Vis-a-vis religion, what was the other thing you said? There was something else I wanted to say, but I spaced on it.
Belief in moral gods?
I can't remember.
Strangers versus friends.
Oh, friends, yes. So we've been doing some work, which I didn't show you today, that's looking at, let me just summarize it very quickly by just saying that what our work has suggested is that the people you choose as your friends share more allelic variance with you, are more like you genetically than individuals you choose as not your friends, drawn from the same population. So what we think is happening, this is big speculation, it's a big leap from the data that we have and that we show, is that people, it is believed by many, and I share that belief, that human beings have a kinship detector. This has been shown in other animals. The evidence is weaker in humans, but I think we probably do have the ability to distinguish kin from non-kin. But I think we have come to apply that apparatus to the selection of our friends. So what happens when you go out and pick from among a population of strictly unrelated individuals who should be your friend, you tend to pick people who actually share a lot of genetic information in common with you, even though they're not your friends. And once you do that, then all of the apparatus for kin selection and everything else can come into play. Because from the point of view of a gene, if you help another human being who shares that variant of that gene, even though that person is unrelated to you, that's all that matters. That you're advancing the propagation of that variant, independent of whether that variant was acquired by that person by descent, because you're relatives, or otherwise. So we have some very speculative ideas and some evidence that actually your way of choosing friends and your ability to help your friends who are even strictly unrelated is also grafted onto a whole other set of ideas, quite independent of religion.
So you see, I was right, we're genetically linked.
Yes, actually. And now actually, but apropos of that, there are a number of possible reasons we all of us share more genetic variants than chance. Part of that may be because we're smart and have been recruited to Yale, so we have those in common. Part of it may be because we were not recruited by a higher power to come here, but rather we sought this environment out. So independent of the agency of anyone else, we sought out this environment. So imagine that you have genetic variants that make you an effective runner, and you go to a place where you find other people who are running, and that's the people from whom you choose to be friends with. It shouldn't be a shocker that you share genes in common with those people. And the third mechanism might be the affirmative choice, the execution of choice from a group of people who to spend time with. So yes, I think Lynn is exactly right.
So just one more question, but I can tell you we have a reception waiting for you in the common room, so you'll get a chance to ask all the remaining questions. So last question, you can pick.
Oh my God, you pick. I can't see any of it. But who's that person in the middle there? Yes, he or she looks like a younger person than the others. There we go. I'm trying to bias towards anyone who plausibly is a student. I can't really tell.
So my question is, how do things like culture or material aspects like class
Yes.
enter into this, like in terms of things that can also configure social structure?
Yes. I'm so glad you mentioned that. Thank you so much. So the question was, what about things like culture and class and how they help determine many of the same topics that I've discussed today. So I'm often misunderstood when I talk about this work as being a genetic determinist. I'm not. I mean, I think there's an equally important role for culture. So I think there's a kind of, as you surely are aware, this endless debate between nature and nurture, and I just think it's a silly dichotomy. I mean, they're both important. And so what I've been presenting today is the ways in which our social structure depends on, to the extent we can ascertain, our biology. But equally, our social structure depends hugely on our culture. For example, if you go to Saudi Arabia, you're not going to find a lot of friendships between men and women. That's got nothing to do with the biology of the people in Saudi Arabia. It's got everything, in my opinion, to do with the culture of the people there, which prohibit those types of, interactions. So the social structure there would be different than here. But what I'm interested in, and one of the things that I'm interested in, is trying to get at what I would regard to be sort of very deep and fundamental aspects of human biology, or our inheritance, from our primate forebears, that help shape the kind of social phenomena that we observe today. And in so doing, I mean no disrespect to the equally important cultural explanations. Note that even when I talked about the variance, only 46% of the variance, or 47% of the variance in how many friends you have was even upper limit was determined by your genes. The majority, the slight majority, had to do with other things: how you were reared, where you were reared, who your parents were, your class, and all of those other phenomena. So they're not mutually exclusive. Did I answer your question? Yeah.
So the reception is in the Google Common Room, which if you go out and turn left, it's just a little ways down the hall. Thank you very much.
Thank you.